Right, this is chapter 18 on the blood. So here's a lovely slide of the blood where you can see all the erythrocytes or red blood cells, which are the majority of the cells. These teeny tiny little particles, these are the platelets. And then these other cells here are the different kinds of leukocytes or white blood cells that you can find in anyone's blood. So the blood is a transport medium. Its job is to carry materials throughout the body using the blood vessels. Things it carries include gases such as oxygen to the tissues, carbon dioxide to get away from the tissues, nutrients, ions such as sodium ions, chlorine, calcium ions, tons of ions in the blood, wastes that we then want to get rid of via the kidneys, such as urea, hormones traveling all through the body, and even heat. Heat is something that the blood can transport. So if you take a sample of blood from someone and spin it in a centrifuge really, really quick, it will separate out based on density, and you'll end up with about 45% of the blood by volume being the erythrocytes, the red blood cells, 55% by volume being the plasma, the liquid portion of the blood, and then a little bitty layer in between called the buffy coat, and that's where we would find all of the white blood cells and platelets. And collectively, the white blood cells, platelets, and erythrocytes are called formed elements because not all of them are true cells. Now, you might have gotten a physical and gotten a blood test and seen on it something telling you your hematocrit. The hematocrit is the percentage by volume of the red blood cells in your blood. And again, what we expect is something around 45%. So by volume, 45% of your blood should be red blood cells, should be erythrocytes. The buffy coat again is the white blood cells, the leukocytes, and the platelets. The plasma is mostly water, 90+% water. Then there are some proteins that are very important for a variety of different functions. And then everything else, the electrolytes, the nutrients, the waste products. So the things that are being transported from point A to point B, there's not a lot of them in the blood because they're going to places and getting taken out of the blood regularly. Proteins. Proteins are very important. There's the albumins. Albumins, their function is to keep water from diffusing out of the bloodstream. So the goal is to help maintain the proper concentration of materials in the blood so that the water will stay in the bloodstream and not constantly leave when it's not necessary. The globulins. Globulins come in two kinds. You have the antibodies. The antibodies are globulins that are involved in our immune response for fighting specific infections. And then transport proteins. The transport proteins, their job is to move lipids, to move the fats and oils throughout the bloodstream because, again, lipids are hydrophobic. They do not like water, so they need something to help them be transported by the blood since it's mostly water. And then finally, fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is an inactive protein, but when it is activated, it helps to produce blood clots to cause the blood to coagulate in order to prevent us from bleeding out. So a very important protein that's prepped and ready to go. All right, formed elements. Again, those are the cell and cell-like structures. So we have the leukocytes, white blood cells, erythrocytes, red blood cells, the platelets. Mostly it's erythrocytes. 99% of the cells in the bloodstream are erythrocytes. All of the blood cells are produced in the red bone marrow. All blood cells produced in the red bone marrow. And then they start with the same pluripotent stem cell, the same stem cell that will lead to the production of all blood cells. And then it just differentiates in different paths to become red blood cells, platelets, and the various white blood cells. So, forming the red blood cells, the erythrocytes. During that process, to give us our functional red blood cells, the nucleus is ejected. So we actually lose the nucleus from red blood cells. This is why they're called formed elements because they lack a nucleus, so they're not a true cell. The mature, again, very few organelles, no mitochondria, no endoplasmic reticulum, no nucleus. They're very small. It's basically exactly the right size to fit through blood capillaries. Hemoglobin is the protein that fills up the red blood cells. So the majority of the inside of the red blood cells is hemoglobin. The function of the hemoglobin is to bind to oxygen. So this is the protein that is critical for transporting oxygen. And within the hemoglobin protein are iron atoms. These iron atoms, as shown there, are critical because they are the component necessary for the binding of the oxygen. So if someone's not getting enough iron in their diet, they may have plenty of hemoglobin being produced, but if it lacks the iron, it's not going to be functional. It's not going to bind to oxygen. Again, cells are concave in shape, look almost like a donut, except the hole doesn't go completely through. This provides them with extra surface area for transporting oxygen into and out of the cell. Again, mostly filled with hemoglobin, lots and lots of hemoglobin to bind the oxygen. The red blood cells themselves make energy anaerobically. This means they do not use oxygen to make energy, which I guess makes sense. If they're transporting oxygen, they shouldn't be using it up as well. And finally, the red blood cells have a relatively short lifespan. They exist for about 120 days. After that, they have to get removed from the bloodstream by the spleen and the liver. And this also explains why there's always a need for blood donations, because again, the blood has a limited shelf life in which it can be used. And finally, it's important to point out that blood is always red. Human blood is always red. It is never any other color but red. It might be a dark red, it might be a light red, but it is always red. Anemia. Anemia is officially the reduced oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, so that the not enough oxygen is being carried by the blood, and then the body is suffering from a lack of oxygen, and that would affect the ability to make energy, to make ATP. Some of the symptoms: paleness of the skin, shortness of breath, weakness, heart palpitations, fatigue, and it can become more severe, leading to fainting, to heart attack. So pretty range of symptoms for anemia. Also, there's a genetic disorder called sickle cell anemia. People with this disorder have a mutation that causes the red blood cells to be shaped more like a curve, more like a sickle, as it were. And unfortunately, these structures for red blood cells make them very fragile, so they end up rupturing a lot, leading to a lot of the significant health consequences of sickle cell anemia. All right, moving on to the white blood cells, or the leukocytes. There are a bunch of different kinds of leukocytes, including the granular leukocytes and the agranular leukocytes. We'll be talking about all of them, most of them, many of them. So, granular leukocytes. Granular because you can see these little spheroids, these little granules in the cells. They are the eosinophil, basophil, neutrophil. So the phils are the granular leukocytes. The agranular leukocytes, such as the lymphocyte and the monocyte, supposedly don't have these granules in them, at least not with a light microscope. And the lymphocyte and monocyte, the sites, are the agranular leukocytes. And they're supposed to be sort of bland, transparent color, but we stained them, so they have these pretty colors because they've been stained when the slide was prepared. Basophils, bilobe nucleus, not that you can see it because of all these big dark purple granules everywhere. It's larger than an erythrocyte. Its normal function is to release enzymes to intensify inflammation, to make inflammation more severe. And this is helpful in fighting infection. However, they can also lead to hypersensitivity, aka allergic reactions, so it can also have a negative impact. Eosinophils, a sort of bilobe nucleus. There's the little reddish granules all throughout, again larger than a red blood cell. The eosinophil's job is to release enzymes to counter inflammation. Again, inflammation can be good for a little bit of time. After that, it needs to cease. And this also helps in countering allergic reactions. The other function of eosinophils is to fight parasitic infections, especially infections by parasitic worms. So eosinophils are important for fighting parasitic infections, worm infections. Neutrophils have a many-lobe nucleus. They have these light purplish granules in their cytoplasm. They're larger than red blood cells. They are active phagocytic cells. They engage in phagocytosis, which means that they will engulf bacteria, dead cell matter, any other pathogens they come across. They will basically engage in phagocytosis against any sort of not expected, not supposed to be there material. And neutrophils are active in both the bloodstream and in the tissues of the body. Monocytes, they have a kidney-shaped or U-shaped nucleus. They have sort of a grayish-blue cytoplasm. They're larger than red blood cells. In the bloodstream, they are inactive. So in blood, monocytes are inactive. However, they can enter tissues, and when they do that, they differentiate, they change and become macrophages. And macrophages are, again, another kind of phagocytic cell, general phagocyte. They will go around engulfing microbes, cellular debris, anything that just shouldn't be in the tissue. Lymphocytes are smaller cells. They tend to be about the same size as a red blood cell, although they can be a bit bigger. They can have an indented nucleus. The nucleus fills up most of the cell volume instead of sort of a light bluish cytoplasm. They are involved in our specific immune response. So they are critical for fighting a specific pathogen that is currently infecting the body. There are a variety of different kinds. The B cells, the B lymphocytes, when activated, become plasma cells, and plasma cells produce the antibodies that can go out and fight the pathogen. T lymphocytes, you have the helper T lymphocytes. They control the specific immune response. They turn on, activate the specific immune response. You have the cytotoxic T cells. Cytotoxic lymphocytes attack infected body cells. So they destroy our own body cells that are infected by a pathogen, a specific pathogen. And the T cells all mature in the thymus, made in the red bone marrow, mature in the thymus. That's why they're called T cells. And then finally, we have the natural killer cells. Natural killer cells go around and destroy abnormal body cells. So natural killer cells will destroy any body cell that is abnormal. So it could be infected with a pathogen, it could be cancerous. So these are the 5 leukocytes found in bloodstream. If one of them or more is increased dramatically in numbers over what's expected, that's called leukocytosis. And that could be a sign of some specific health condition. And this is one of the reasons why we have blood tests done. A computer will count the white blood cells, let's say differential white blood cell count, and list the percentages for the leukocytes, the white blood cells. And that could give a clue as to what's going on. So if someone has elevated levels of basophils, say, maybe they're trying to having allergic reactions, and that's why this elevated, and there's a problem for them. This is actually a chart from a differential white blood cell count for myself, and then last time, as you can see, it's covering blood tests from over years. You can see they're kind enough to give us the normal range so that you know that, yes, those white blood cells are in the right range. They don't actually tell you what it is, so it's kind of confusing. But we know basos and basophils. Okay, those are my basophil levels. Eosinophils, okay, I had a slightly elevated once, but wasn't a real issue. Lymphocytes, there they are. Monocytes and neutrophils. Now you know a little bit more about those results you see when the doctor does a blood test for you. And we will stop right here and start the next part with this slide.